Wonderful. Okay. So thank you everyone for taking the time to join tonight and tonight here. Um, I think to introduce myself a little bit, I'll just share a brief history of my Dharma path and also my interest in psychotherapy. So in 1970, I met my Buddhist teacher, Chogyam Trungpa Rinpoche. And so I studied with him for much of the 17 years that he was alive. And I would say that while there were many gifts from his teachings, the gift that I treasured the most was his teaching on how we're inherently, basically, unconditionally good, and that all human beings possess the same degree of goodness, inherent goodness, and the same degree of inherent sanity and compassion and skill to actually care for themselves and others. And at the same time, that goodness often is covered over by conditioning from our growing up and acquiring maybe some beliefs or extreme beliefs that often cause us and those we love a lot of suffering. And so much of the Buddhist path, as well as the Shambhala path, the secular path that he taught, was about how to practice mindfulness meditation in such a way that from the very beginning, one is willing to experience one's emotions, one's thoughts, and so on, without judgment. So it's not a question of trying to edit one's experience at all. And Trungpa Rinpoche was just a master at really conveying the profound sense of openness, relaxation, humor, and care that was possible for anyone really to access if we were able to work with our conditioning and our habits, the ways that we are self-limiting. So that was more than 50 years ago when I first started studying Buddhism with Rinpoche. And in the mid-70s, I started teaching Buddhism and then in the 80s, Shambhala training and so on. And I couldn't imagine a more profound, more helpful, more immediate, more penetrating practice and teachings than what he taught. However, as I've grown older, I've had to come to the realization that for me anyway, meditation isn't enough. And I've had quite a few conversations with friends of mine about this, my Dharma friends. In fact, they asked me that. Why isn't it enough? What's, kind of the implication is if you really were practicing Buddhism, you really wouldn't need anything, right? And my answer is, I really do practice Buddhism and I really do need something else. And the reason for that actually goes back to a teaching that my current teacher, my living teacher now, Sogni Rinpoche, some of you may know of Sogni Rinpoche. One of the teachings he gave that I again, really, really struck a chord for me was the idea that Western practitioners of Buddhism, he found, often had emotional wounds that were, in some sense, getting in the way of their Buddhist practice. They would do their mindfulness awareness practice. People would be able to settle their minds. They'd be able to relax and open up. And then things got messy. Then the emotions began to really arise. And for me personally, as I've done many retreats and done a lot of practice, and what I began to realize is that what he says is true. There's wounds that I have not found meditation to be particularly effective at helping to liberate. So that may be a problem with my meditation. So this is a disclaimer. If this is useful to you, that's great. And if it's not, that's fine too. But for me, the reason this talk is called A Hole in the Heart of Awareness is that after many decades of practice, I actually felt like I was failing at my practice. In fact, I felt like the practice was no longer resonating for me. And so Sogyal Rinpoche's teachings on working with the wounds, the emotional wounds that he basically sees in all Westerners. He said he hasn't met someone who doesn't have them. So I find that interesting, as well as reassuring. He described it pretty much as childhood trauma. And when we have habitual ways of, let's say, perfectionism or self-criticism or self-sabotaging in various ways, those of us that have that as a habit, he basically said we need to make friends really care for that part, that energy. And he called it a beautiful monster. The part of us that comes up in our practice or in our lives that basically feels like it's sabotaging our well-being. Now, I have friends who I've talked to about this, and they basically, this doesn't resonate for them. They feel they're fine as they are with the practice they have. And I have friends who say, yeah, I have the same thing. I'm really hard on myself, and I'm in retreat and I cry, or I feel I can't really rest my mind. There's just so much speed, so much busyness. And so I basically started practicing with Sogyal Rinpoche's approach. He calls it handshake practice. And what handshake practice is a willingness to let go of thought and drop into the body and actually feel what we feel. So according to his teachings, the problem that many Westerners have is that we grew up being taught that feeling is dangerous, that vulnerability is dangerous. It's a problem. And so we actually need to be strong. We need to either put on a brave front or whatever we please other people, anything but confront our kind of inner demons, so to speak, our beautiful monsters. And so his practice is very much about, even before one meditates, there's a willingness to drop into the body and feel what we feel rather than think about what we feel. And as we all know, those of us who've studied Buddhism, Buddhism has a very strong intellectual component, a prajna component, where it's very important to sharpen our minds and look clearly and contemplate and so on, use our thoughts, use our logic. All of that's great. And at the same time, unless we can actually feel our feelings, those thoughts, that logic, that kind of intellectual approach actually pushes us further away from caring for ourselves. We become more remote with our own kind of inner experience. So I practiced handshake practice for quite a few years, found it really helpful. And then I kind of hit another hole in the heart of my awareness, where handshake practice was no longer quite doing it for me. Unfortunately, I'm married to a therapist who is extremely curious and exploring all kinds of things. And so I just get to hold on to her coattails, and she introduces me to really some fabulous things, my wife, Maya. And she introduced me to internal family systems maybe about a year and a half ago or so. And what immediately grabbed me about internal family systems is the similarity to the Buddhist teaching on the truth of suffering. That, if you feel you've been practicing a long time and you shouldn't be suffering so much, this is the practice for you. Because if we are suffering, that suffering actually from an I.F.S. point of view is a call, is a message, is a request for us to actually turn our attention toward the suffering rather than just try to calm it down through meditation. So, in mindfulness meditation, quite often we label our thoughts thinking, and then we rest in our in our body and feel connected with our heart and mind. We feel synchronized. It's all good. The problem is that the moment there's that much space, when we're not caught in our thoughts, that's exactly when the emotions begin to come up. And those emotions quite often are, for me anyway, conflicting emotions. There are emotions striving to be a good practitioner, for example, is a real common one for me. Or how come I have so many thoughts? By this time, after 50 years, shouldn't there be a little less thought and a little more space? And so on. So I.F.S. basically is this kind of, how do I put it? It's probably the kindest, most curious and non-judgmental psychotherapeutic approach that I've encountered. And I've worked a lot with experiential focusing method from Eugene Genlin, which I find has been really good. And transactional analysis has been fantastic. That goes back a long ways. That has many wonderful elements and others as well. But for me, this is my sales pitch, I.F.S. actually picks up where meditation leaves off. That instead of just being with a kind of settled sense of openness and working with the breath, one actually begins to turn one's attention toward where the suffering is coming from and taking a genuine interest in it. So I'm just going to describe the I.F.S. model for a moment and also talk about it in relation to Buddhism. So Richard Schwartz is the person who initially came up with this, and he was a family therapist, and he had some patients, some young women who were bulimic, and he noticed as he talked with them that they were talking about a part of me wants to binge, a part of me wants to, whatever, anorexic and also bulimic. And so he saw that there were these polarized parts in these patients. And he said, gee, the more these young women describe their experience, the more it sounds like a family. And that's where internal family systems began to kind of evolve, is that there are roles, there are parts of us that have different roles within us, like a family. And there are parts that are managerial. There are parts that try to come to the rescue if we're in trouble. There are parts that hold the wounds that are called exiles, that hold the wounding from childhood and adolescence. And then there's also something that's not a part called self energy, self with a big S. And one thing that Dick Schwartz says about self, he says, okay, you Buddhists, I know you're worried already. I'm using the word self. Self is the same as egolessness. So then, okay, it's okay. So what is self? Self is not a part. Self is the inherent wakefulness, Buddha nature, basic goodness. It's a sense of unconditional openness, compassion, courage, playfulness, humor, all the things that we associate with enlightenment. And according to Dick Schwartz and how he evolved this particular protocol, he said, the way this works is, as a child, we are in self-energy. We're wide open. Now, we don't have any self-awareness about that self-energy because we're children. We don't know yet, but we are wide open. And we're interested. We're learning so much all the time. But inevitably, there's going to be some neglect or some rejection or some abuse. Something will happen, probably more than one thing, that makes us feel unsafe, makes us feel that somehow being a child with our caregivers, with our parents or teachers or family, whomever, that we're not entirely safe. So maybe we're told we're too loud, or we're too quiet, or either too much or too little. We're not perfect. We're bad. So shame begins to come in. And when shame begins to come in, that's when what's called an exile is basically created. So an exile is a part that basically takes that shame and is then repressed by other parts. Because as a child, we can't deal with that sense of being inadequate, no good, not worthy. We don't know what to do with that. And so we repress it. And the parts that repress it are two. They're both called protectors in I.F.S. So one protector is called a manager. A manager is basically a proactive part that is scanning the horizon and just making sure that our life goes on fairly calmly and nothing too dangerous happens to us. It is based in fear, this protective part, but its job is to keep things on an even keel and to keep the exile repressed, because the exile is holding all that shame, all that pain that we were unable to deal with when we were young. So I'm going to be a little bit exposing a little bit about myself here. So I grew up in a household where I was not safe physically, and where there was a lot of fear, a lot of anger, and a small amount, but enough, of physical abuse. And the way I dealt with that is I blame myself. And what Dick Schwartz talks about is every child blames themselves, because our lives are dependent on our caregivers, on our parents. And so we feel it must be me that's the problem, because if it's them, we're definitely in hot water. So according to I.F.S, that is how a child deals with a trauma. They submerge it, they manage it. So a part is recruited. And by the way, I think this is important too. We're all born with this multiple sense of self. So what Dick says is, we're not a unitary self. We're basically this vast consciousness, which is called self-energy, which is not a part. And within that are these many other parts, the protectors and so on. And he said that when a trauma happens, a part is recruited to be a manager. So the parts are completely intrinsic to being human. Being multiple this is not multiple personality, by the way. This is just the way it is for everybody. We have these parts that basically have jobs, and they take their job seriously and they're loyal to them, even if they're suffering with that job. So for example, perfectionism, which I have in spades, or being a bit OCD, or being extremely, careful, conscientious, hypervigilant. All of those are managerial parts. And then whenever there's a problem that the manager can't handle, the other part comes in. The other part's called a firefighter. So the model is actually very simple, but profound as you kind of get into it. So a firefighter's job is to distract us from the exile, from the pain of the exile. Because the exile is getting triggered, and when we get triggered, we begin to feel a lot of fear, and we're afraid of the shame that's beginning to come out. Shame, loneliness, hollowness, a sense of not being complete, or being dependent on others, or being a people pleaser, or whatever we are. So there's a kind of need for a part to distract us from all that. So binge drinking or watching TV or whatever, that is a firefighter coming in to kind of distract us from the suffering that's about to be released. So the whole point is to keep the system in equilibrium through repression or suppression. And through I.F.S, what happens is we begin to tune into what it means to be in self-energy rather than blended with a part, blended with either the manager or the firefighter or the exile. And we can have quite a number of exiles, and they can be chronological. There can even be prenatal exiles if you weren't safe in the womb, for example. So the idea is that we learn how to actually recognize self-energy, which as Buddhists, to be honest, is not that difficult. Because if anyone has practiced a lot of shamatha vipassana or mindfulness awareness practice, knowing how to just sort of be open and not caught in your thoughts is really helpful. In fact, I think that's a great contribution of Buddhism to therapy. It's just being able to not just be mindful, but also aware, actually aware of what one's feeling, but not caught in the feeling. With I.F.S, we actually are aware of the feeling. Let's take anger. Let's say we're in a situation and someone says something and we feel insulted or we feel hurt in some way, and anger begins to come up. That's usually a protector. And as an I.F.S practitioner, if we have the time, we would actually do what Dick would call a 180-degree U-turn. So instead of being angry, we would basically turn around and say, oh, anger, you just came up. Something just happened. What came up that made you feel this way? Now, these parts aren't used to our talking with them. In fact, even though I would imagine everyone talks to themselves, I think everyone pretty much does, it's weird to actually feel that that's a formal practice. You have to actually turn around and say, hi, angry part. What happened right now that made you come up? And once a part begins to recognize that there is an adult present, self-energy present, that is genuinely caring and interested, that part begins to feel recognized. And it begins to feel heard if we're listening, if we're not caught in the part. So in I.F.S, it's called a trailhead. The minute there's something that comes up that we recognize there's some kind of, you could say, extreme belief or extreme emotion behind it, rather than trying to subdue it, we come into awareness the same as we would in meditation practice, and then, in essence, turn around and inquire and care for that part. This is very similar to Sodhi Rinpoche's teachings on handshake practice, which is to be with a part that is feeling fear or anger, whatever. But what's different is that we actually spend time getting to know that part and reassuring that part that we're not going to ignore it anymore. And that has a very profound effect on the part, because if it's a protective part, it's trying to keep the exile from coming up. It's trying to prevent us from getting flooded by something painful. And our job as being in self-energy is to turn to these parts and say, do you know what year it is? Do you know how old I am? So for example, in my own I.F.S therapy practice, I've had my experience of, I'll ask a part, how old am I? And that part will say 3. Because the parts that are recruited to suppress the trauma are the same age as when the trauma happened. So it's fascinating to find in yourself very young parts trying to handle very difficult emotions. So the idea is to actually get to know each part and ask its permission to get to know the exile that it's protecting. So one works with the manager, works with the firefighters, and eventually one actually through actually feeling it's in your body in a place, and it can manifest. It's very much a kind of altered state, to be honest. Eyes are closed, and one begins to get images and begins to get a felt sense of a particular pattern, particular energy. Whether it's anger or inquisitiveness, or could be anything, not just negative things, could be anything, but they're parts. And quite often parts are polarized with each other. So one might have a part that's very, let's say, controlling or precise, and another part saying, just relax. Can't you relax? Just relax. And these two go at it. So much of I.F.S is also helping parts to recognize that they are in these polarized relationships and to begin to actually help them hear each other. The whole point of I.F.S is to get to know your whole system, to care for each part so that when it does come up in the future, it knows you will listen and it can express its pain or its burden or its confusion. That there isn't any judgment. And there also isn't any need to just say, it's all empty, it's all luminous, it's all okay. Because for me anyway, that's not enough. I have a part that says, oh yeah, you're just luminous, you're just empty. Over here. Does that make sense? I hope that makes sense. So the liberating thing about I.F.S. is all parts, there are no bad parts. There are no parts that are fundamentally negative. All parts take on a particular role based on our circumstances and our family history and our family culture, and kinds of things. And when we recognize that these parts have been working hard for so many years, trying to protect us, and we've been rejecting that part, feeling badly about having that part, it is kind of personally life-altering to recognize everything is accepted. Everything can be allowed to be there. If I can take an interest in it and not just get caught in it. So in I.F.S, it's called blended. If we're blended with a part, we're stuck in a part. And we believe we are that part when we're stuck in it. But if we unblend from the part, just like in mindfulness practice, we unblend from our thoughts, then that part has enough space to actually talk to us, relate with us, and our self-energy can relate to that part. From the point of view of trauma, when the traumas were created in childhood, there wasn't an adult present that was able to help us that we could see. And so we had to suppress this. By showing up in self-energy with our parts, we are finally the adult that these parts have been waiting for. Loving, respectful, not judging. So Dick Schwartz talks about even suicidal parts, their intention is positive. Save the system from more suffering. Obviously, we don't want them to go ahead and execute that plan, but it's helpful for that part to know we respect its job so that it doesn't feel it has to flood our system with negative suicidal thoughts. So the whole point of I.F.S is everything, all the parts, you get your arms around the whole thing, your whole system. Parts you inherited from family members or from your family lineage. So in I.F.S, there's what's called legacy burdens, which are basically carried intergenerational trauma. Many of us have parents who were in Second World War and Great Depression, so on. All of that epigenetically is also part of our system. Those parts too have a way to be cared for, recognized, and allowed to release. And the idea is that once we've been able to care for all these protectors and get to the exiles, we find often they're what Dick calls basement children. They've been in the basement so long and hidden from view and such an embarrassment to ourselves. And finally, we're actually opening the door and letting in the light and the air. And they recognize they no longer have to be pounding on the basement door. They're actually invited to go where they feel most comfortable and share their suffering with us. Tell us about how it has been, in my case, for 70 years. So that's a very short synopsis, but I was hoping we could have a good discussion rather than my just the talking head tonight. So maybe we could stop now and just begin to, any questions you have or comments or concerns, we can talk about that. And then if there's more to go, there's a little more I'd like to share about Buddhism, but I'd like to first hear about I.F.S, what you think of I.F.S thus far. So whoever would like to speak, please do.
It's Brian here. I'm amazed as I'm listening to this at how much sense it makes, but not just intellectually, also in my heart, in my soul. And and I had the thought of like all these different parts. I it would be like welcoming them and being kind and gentle with them and yeah, there's all sorts of positive things come up for me as I'm listening to you speak, and I and I thank you for being open and telling us about yourself. I am moved by that.
Thank you.
Can I just briefly remind new people who are not here, we're here in the original, when we first started, this is being recorded. Thank you.
Anyone else?
James, have you been you've been receiving this form of therapy as well as practicing it?
Oh, Alan, sorry, we're using Jim's.
Oh, I'm sorry, Alan. Yeah, I'm sorry.
That's all right. I like the name Jim. You know, I could use a change, really. Yeah, yeah. I was really fortunate to work with a therapist he's tremendous. He's he's been doing it for many years. He was a child who was severely abused sexually and was really nearly destroyed by that. And through I.F.S, he was able to unburden those exiles that have carried so much pain. And then he became a psychotherapist because he could not, his life turned around and he actually had something to give rather than just feeling this huge hole. So yeah, amazing person. And then, yeah, and now I'm working with a therapist in Canada who is a close associate of my first therapist, and she's magnificent. Yeah, it's speaking as a Vajrayana Buddhist, someone who's been practicing a long time. I must admit there was a kind of what's the word? I had to deal with a part that was embarrassed that I should be much more together and not have to do this. But then when I turned toward that part, I could really begin to talk with this part about why it feels I should have my act together as a Buddhist. What's wrong with pain and suffering? Does that make me a bad person? And once I was able to really hear its situation, what it actually experiences, this part that wants me to be perfect or something, I could really feel how much of a burden it's been carrying for so long, trying to be good. And when I thanked it, and because it's used to my not liking it, when I thanked it, it was really moving because it recognized that I actually genuinely heard it. It wasn't just being regarded as a nuisance or arrogant or something. It was trying to protect me from something new that might hurt me. And the more I work with the technique myself with my therapist, and also what I did is, I think I mentioned in the blurb, so I went and studied at Adler Institute in Canada. In Toronto, there's an online course that was offered, 2 7-week courses. And it's been great because I can work, I have worked with clients. I am retired as a leadership coach. And I'm currently contemplating getting back into coaching, but as an I.F.S. informed coach. But I haven't decided that yet. But yeah, I must admit, after so much practice and so much therapy, I maybe for the first time ever in my life, I can honestly say, and I don't mean to make this sound schmoozy or what's schmaltzy or something, but it's like, wow, I could actually be in the present and not find fault with anything, especially myself. So yeah, to me, that's like, wow, I could actually relax. I don't think I knew how to relax before. I looked like I was relaxed, but I wasn't relaxed. Inside was hope and fear.
I was just gonna say I really appreciate what you were saying earlier on about parts being at odds with each other. And um, in Buddhism, there's this thing about giving a cow a big pasture,
Right.
and they wear themselves out. And like we wear out ego, or we wear out so many different things that we could wear out. But when I was listening to you talk about those parts at odds, I over the last few years, I've been telling myself no more war, which is about those parts fighting.
That's right.
And you know, and when you start noticing it and how tired you are, it's really exhausting.
It is.
And I feel extremely exhausted. So for the last few years, I finally had enough economic stability that I could actually notice how much I struggle more so. And so it seems like good timing to put more support around that genuine desire to not have so much inner struggle with myself, so.
Yeah, well said. What's interesting is that to actually go toward the struggle rather than try to calm it. I mean, there's so much traffic inside, you know. There's a lot of parts that are in constellation with each other. There's allied parts. There's parts that are allied against other parts. And it's just the way my family, my karma, it's just the way things evolved. But the way Dick talks about it is everyone has parts. Everyone has self-energy, has self-awareness. The question is, can we recognize self-awareness so that then we know when we get blended with a part? Because unless we're aware of self-energy, we just think these parts are us. I'm an angry guy. I'm a funny guy. I'm a worried guy, whatever. But those are parts. That's not self-energy. So you could say like, Buddha nature or basic goodness isn't just a kind of nice idea. Someday I'll experience it. And I.F.S. it's actually inherent in the protocol itself. One has to be, to some extent, at least a little in self-energy, in self-awareness, to turn around and face a part that's been scaring us for a long time. And to do it with actual compassion and a lot of curiosity and a lot of spaciousness and respect. When these parts recognize that we actually feel that way, that we're not putting it on, and that we're not there to manipulate them or change them or fire them or get rid of them, then a lot of magic can happen. And that magic is parts begin to give permission for us to go deep and work with where the wounds are, really strong. And for some of us, from a Buddhist perspective, some of these wounds have been going on for lifetimes. They're not just this life. But I think the main point is everything is workable if we can actually turn around, care for, and help unburden our parts and know them, actually get to know them. So that when we are driving and someone cuts us off, the part comes up that goes, you, and we go, oh, hello. We don't short circuit the part. We just recognize we don't have to blend with the part. It has a right to be angry that so-and-so cut us off, but we don't have to actually be the part. And that's a huge relief.
Just say something.
Maya, what do you think so far? Sorry, did I cut somebody off?
I'm on my phone and I'm not quite sure if this is Ocean talking. He's
Hi.
not on date. I'm curious about the blending.
Right.
So to unblend, is it that you just have to be, not just, but you have to be more in your self-awareness part?
That's right.
Is that?
Yeah.
And how does Dick Schwartz say, you know, because we're all meditation practitioners, but someone who's not, how do you help someone get more into that big S self to,
Right.
you know, unblend from these parts?
Yeah, that's right. So there are I.F.S. meditation practices.
Okay.
So a typical I.F.S. meditation practice would be, and this is again would be for somebody who is already kind of working with a therapist and so has a bit of a grip on the protocol and understanding, okay, self-energy, layers of protectors, child in the basement that's hoping someday to be free. And he says what you do is you ask all your parts to step out because you would like to take a walk and you'd like to take this walk and just catch your breath. And catching your breath, being in self-energy will help you to help them when you return, that you are not abandoning them and that you're really willing to commit fully to caring for each and every one of them. And so that practice is you would literally imagine the parts you're aware of already and asking them to step out. And you're, let's say, in your favorite field or forest or backyard or wherever you feel most comfortable, and you actually leave the parts behind and experience a sense of opening.
Alan, would it be helpful to talk about the qualities of self?
Sure.
Yeah.
Great. So, in Buddhism, the qualities of awareness, in terms of like Buddha nature kind of awareness, is sort of a vast openness, a sense of like unrestricted, vast, and which Buddhists call emptiness, which is can be a confusing word for us because we associate emptiness with nothing, but that's not what Buddhism talks about. It says there really basically is this huge openness, and within this openness, lots of things happen. The things that are happening are phenomena, thoughts, emotions, sensations, all kinds of things. But there isn't an ego, a solid self, that needs to see everything and label it as good, bad, right, wrong, up, down. There's a sense of wisdom that's inherent that sees directly what is true. And that's why the word dharma is truth or law. It's the actual way things are. In I.F.S., Dick talks about, I think, 8 qualities, and I don't know if I can remember them all. Maya, if I forget, please chime in. So one of the main points is the kind of quality of clarity, which is also in Buddhism, one of the qualities of Buddha nature. Compassion, courage, calmness. Maya, can you help me out?
Connection,
Connection, right?
Oh, there's Monica.
courage,
She has them.
Oh, good. I have them written down.
creativity.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Hi, Melinda.
Compassion, curiosity. Yeah, I can't.
Compassion, calm, clarity, curiosity, courage, connection. Dick Schwartz doesn't always get the 8 C's either. I just saw a video.
Yeah, I know that's true. But fortunately, I have a part that's okay with that because I'm okay with that. But yeah, but what I love about I.F.S. Is it has like an active. The self energy is kind of active. It's not a kind of passive opening. It's a sense of being willing to engage fully with whatever you're experiencing. The basic problem in a way is intensity. One way of looking at trauma is we had an intense experience, so intense we can't bear it. And so we reduce it by suppressing it. And that intensity scares us. And so we live a life where we keep reducing the intensity because we don't know what to do with it. In I.F.S, in self-energy, it's possible, I've read, and maybe I've had a little taste of this, that one can actually turn around and face the part and begin to inquire. And there is a sense of tremendous intensity when that part recognizes you're listening. And relief that a part has a right to be as it is, as intense as it is. It doesn't need to be subdued. If we're in self-energy, we're not put off by its intensity. When we blend with a part that's intense, we feel uptight or feel overwhelmed or flooded. So self-energy has these 8 qualities because it's capable of engaging directly with every part, no matter how scary or how blanking, how ignorant, how kind of foggy. It can talk to any part. So often states of mind that we just think are somewhat random are in fact parts trying to communicate. So often we have blocking parts, that if we get too close to something that's scary inside us, a blocking part comes in to protect us, probably a firefighter. So understanding that intensity is really what we're kind of fundamentally working with. And that intensity is just pure. It's not good or bad. It's just the way it actually is. So we don't need to actually judge it. It is exactly as it is. Our anger is as angry as it is. Our passion is as passionate as it is. But there isn't a sense of comparing, evaluating, judging. It's just, it's a straight, direct experience. So I love the fact that self-energy in I.F.S is not just being on retreat and staring, into space and feeling open and good. That's fine, but I find that's most helpful for connecting with self-energy, and then go in and work with what in fact is scariest and most challenging, confusion. Did that answer did I address your question? Anyone else?
Yeah, could you talk a little bit more on like how this, what sort of parts there are, like maybe anxious parts and depressed parts, and how, because most people who are therapists, how can they use that in their practice, compared to how they usually use, talk therapy or something? How is it different?
Yeah. But for one thing, in I.F.S, the therapist is transparent, which means that the therapists themselves are working to remain in self-energy and relate to their parts that are being triggered by their client. So Dick talks about therapist parts, for example. So not just transference, that's part of it, but it's more that we're human beings and we're relational, and all trauma is relational. Trauma happens in relation to others. And so it takes relation to heal the trauma, rather than we can just do it on our own. So anxiety, basically, if I talk about myself for a moment, because I wasn't safe at home, I learned to be on high alert. And I've talked to a lot of people actually who say they have the same thing. There's this sense of having to be very watchful, and that wherever we are, no matter how seemingly comfortable or whatever, we don't really feel safe. So that's my experience. And I don't want to project that on anyone else, but I certainly have met other people who feel the same way. So knowing that there's this high alert part, which if it's not respected, turns into anxiety. High alert is like, paranoia. In my in my second interview with my teacher in 1972, I walked in and he said, "You don't have to be so paranoid." That really made me paranoid. How could he see it? How could he see how frightened I am? But he did. He was amazing. So that paranoia is actually an old friend in a sense. My high alertness, my paranoia is deserving of care and respect rather than being paranoid, being anxious. So if I'm able to actually feel the anxiety as a felt sense in my body and begin to care for it, talk to it, ask it about its experience, and update it so it realizes I'm actually 73 and not 7. It's amazing when the parts actually recognize that we're not the age when they first got their jobs. It's amazing. There really is a sense of, wow, how did that happen? Where did the 50, 60, 70 years go? I wasn't here for that. That's how the part feels. So these are parts that are locked into habitual patterns, right? Let's see. Maya, is that close to what you thought?
Sure, yeah, that's definitely helpful. Yeah, and I think that, not diagnosing, clients as depressed or anxious and that there's something wrong with them. That's all based on our adaptations, right? From experience as kids, and that we're trying to keep us safe, right? To really have this view that whatever presents itself is actually a way to keep the person safe or used to, and now then it's maladaptive because it's we're no longer living with our parents, or no longer in that situation that caused those adaptations.
Yeah, well said.
It's Brian here.
I'll leave it.
It would be tempting to just to say, oh, I like this feature and that, or that feature, and dabble with it with a patient or client. But I'm assuming that would not be a good idea, and it might be counterproductive, because in order to really use the concepts appropriately, one should be really well versed in it, which then leads to the question of how much training one needs to use these principles, and whether or not you do sort of mix them with other forms of therapy, or whether you stick strictly to the I.F.S. approach when you're working with somebody.
Yeah, so in terms of certification, there are programs in the US through the I.F.S. Institute. And it's, to be honest, Brian, it's actually difficult for therapists to get into the training. For example, there were 3 cohorts. I think there were about 33 people in each of the 3 cohorts, and there were 7,000 applicants. So I.F.S. is really, I guess it's really on the radar, and there aren't enough trainers to accommodate all the people that want training. The training that I did was in Canada with Derek Scott, who's an I.F.S., a longtime I.F.S. trainer, and who's a close friend of Dick Schwartz. And it was enough for me, because I'm not looking for the credential per se. I really wanted to understand the theory and the protocol. And I also wanted to have time to actually work on myself as a client through working with a therapist. And I think that's something that seemed to be key to I.F.S. Dick says that it's a rare individual that could really unburden and exile themselves. It really does generally take
Just wanted
therapists to work with.
To what Brian said. Sorry, yeah, I just want to say that, Brian, in your practice, I would say that, do you know Gabor Mate's compassionate inquiry?
I've read about it, but I'm not versed with it.
Oh, okay, but it's a similar idea that you really ask, where did this come from? Who did you see do this at home? Like really try to understand where, or how is the depressed part trying to keep you safe, right? Or what is the anxiety trying to prevent you from feeling, or, so it's really like trying to see the function and then try to go what it's trying to do for you, right? How is that?
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
really understanding that everything has a reason why it's there.
Yes.
Not what's random, right?
Yeah. Thank you.
And people do combine modalities in answer to your question about that. Definitely.
And I have a question. Thank you so much for this opportunity to learn more. I used to work a lot with families, so like mother and daughter, and families that were dealing with palliative situations and end of life care. Many times there were stories in these families that were stories that every member had a very different story. Right? So it was so interesting bringing them together, and then they realized, wow, it didn't happen that way. So I'm curious, in I.F.S, what would be the tools or the approach a therapist could use, not necessarily to bring another family member together, but just to open space for recreating stories?
So let me just ask you if I've understood this. So I know in my own family, if I have two brothers, an older and a younger one, if we were to sit down and talk about our parents, we had three different parents, three different fathers, three different mothers, because our experience were so different. And I think that's really common. I think, I'm sure there's an I.F.S approach to family therapy, but that's not something that I've learned yet. Probably, I don't know if I will, but for me, as I understand it, it's recognizing how much we've been influenced by so many people in our lives, not just our parents, but teachers and others who transmitted either something very helpful to us or transmitted some sort of adaptation that actually causes us some problem. And shame is almost always at the base of the problem, which is a sense of, not being fundamentally good and afraid that someone will find out that we actually are not good. So, I think families hold so many secrets. There's exiles in the family system. So, we have our own system, but the families have a system too. And there is exiles and protectors in a family as well.
Yeah.
It's all fractals. That's what I.F.S says. It's fractals. It's parts all the way up and down. It's just like individual, family, neighborhood, community, goes on that way. It's the same for I.F.S. Cultures have exiles. Cultures have protectors. Be strong, that kind of thing. So, but from the point of view of someone working with themselves, one encounters a lot of that just from working with oneself. One can see how, a part holds this belief that I should be strong, never weak. Why? And then we find out what that part got this job, just to really be sure we're strong. Because if we're not strong, and this is an I.F.S question, what would happen if you didn't do your job? And then you start to really feel the exile. You begin to really feel, if the protector didn't protect you, what would happen? That shame, that loneliness, that unbearable sense of nobody cares, I'm not lovable, whatever it may be, that starts to come up. So I kind of feel like it's all there. You know, if one can work with oneself, one can then turn and work with one's family, because you begin to see how their parts trigger your parts. And if one is able to remain in self energy as those family members begin to engage, and if we don't get caught, it's so fundamentally helpful to the family. It's fundamentally helpful to relationship, to a marriage, to parenting, that we don't blame others for their parts.
Thank you so much.
I wanted to, if that's, I was one of the lucky ones to get into the training last year. I thought I'm in private practice and so in love with EMDR, and I thought, oh, I don't need another ego state therapy. I heard about I.F.S. And for some reason, last February, I started listening to the second edition of the handbook, just in the car kind of thing.
Oh,
I'm like, what? That's impossible. And I'm like, so the first thing I did was I signed up for there's an online training they do that's for non-therapists and therapists, called the Online Circle. That's for about $600 over 6 months. That has it has like 7 hours of material, but only like an hour or two per month. That's the core teaching. And then it has every month a Q&A. 1 month it's with either Tony Herban Blank, and then the next with a senior teacher and Pamela Krause, and then 2 out of the 6 months it's with Dick Schwartz. And so it's not a two-dimensional teaching like the level 1 training is, or the Derek Scott's, I think. But it's a really good, I think, for therapists, but also for others if we want to use it for ourselves. It's a really good way of getting into it. But yeah, also all the books. And one thing that in terms of self and parts, what I like is the metaphor of self is kind of like the sun. It can't be damaged. It's there, even, and the parts, if they're activated because of trauma, because they're worried, because they want to protect, then it obscures the sun, but it can't, just like clouds, it can obscure it, but it's always there. So yeah.
Wonderful.
And so the 6 months training really goes through how that unblending, how to help oneself, how to help others to be able to unblend more and more, to have self more often. Yeah. I think that's what I wanted to say.
Thank you. Great. Yeah.
Yeah.
Well,
I also thought maybe one more thing. I found 2 14 or 15 page documents really helpful that really summarize the model. One is by Derek Scott, How to Work with Your Own System, and the other one is by a German coach called Lukas Forstmeier. That's very nicely done too, that I really like. So I could put the links in the chat if there's interest.
That would be great. And I think
I'll do that right now.
Thanks. After the talk, basically when I get back home to Halifax, I'll put together a collection of resources, and I'll send the links to Jim, and Jim can just send it to everybody. So yeah, if Jim would do that.
Could I ask a question?
Sure.
Hi, I'm here with Licia. I'm Joel.
Hi, Joel.
Hi, thank you so much for this very interesting presentation. I'm trying to do a little bit of translation here. I'm more familiar with some other systems like Jungian psychoanalysis. And I'm just wondering, what would you say the relationship is between consciousness, where the exiles are exiled from, I think, and self-energy?
That's a great question. So this is my flying by the seat of my pants, right? But I believe that consciousness is a part. It's a self-like part. So it's how it's sort of like when I'm feeling okay and I'm not caught, I feel a certain kind of calmness in my system. But I'm not necessarily engaging and caring for the parts that are suffering. So, because the job of the parts is to keep us from suffering, and they may do that by actually inflicting some suffering on us, but just enough suffering to keep us from going any deeper, really looking at that exile. So I think consciousness has this sort of quality of, I'm okay. The problem is that it's very fragile. It isn't stable. And it doesn't really have enough curiosity and respect for the system. So that's my experience of my Alan's consciousness. But self energy is totally, when I've had the experience of it, there's nothing it doesn't want to know about in the system. And it's not navel gazing. It's actually really, it's tough work. I mean, it's, one really tastes just how much pain has been there, going on there. And it's like, wow. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So that's my guess, that there is a kind of self-like part that it's managerial, it has its act together. And it's fine, it gets us through our day, and we're reasonable, and but at the same time, it simply isn't curious and brave enough and compassionate enough to really turn around and go deep, take a trailhead, take anything that comes up and be willing to work with it. It's just trying to keep things okay. Does that resonate?
Yeah, that's very good. So the exile is not actually exiled from self energy.
No.
It's just exiled from the consciousness part.
That's right. So you could think of the consciousness part as actually being sort of ignorant. It wants a certain feeling tone, and it wants to feel safe, and it's okay. Self energy would see that as a part and say, so you want to be safe and you want everything to be kind of calm. Is that right?
Mm-hmm.
Would talk to that part. The exiles, if we go back to childhood, this is again coming from Dick Schwartz, a child is in self energy. And then something happens. Neglect, abuse, something happens, and they learn that being in self energy is not safe. Being open and vulnerable is not safe. And so that part is exile, is pushed down because it's not safe to be in self energy. And then it's all adaptive behaviors from there. Different parts saying be good, be perfect, or people please, or the opposite, kind of a rebel child approach, But whatever it is, it's all about hope and fear. Once we've rejected self-energy, we're chasing it the rest of our life, wishing we could be more open, wishing we could be more playful, wishing we could be more engaging, wishing we could be more transparent, not so fearful, all that stuff. But that's a part that's holding those kinds of views. That's not self-energy.
Thank you.
Could I ask another question?
Oh, please.
I think Brian was asking earlier if practitioners combine modalities.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm very smart, and I know that you guys are too, but whenever I get a chance to be conceptual, I can do a lot of bullshitting. And maybe 15 years ago, I studied Rosen method bodywork for a few years. And I think it would, and then another thing I've used to help is nonviolent communication.
Oh, me too, I love that, yeah.
And, so I'm wondering if they do blend the modalities, because I think I need something where a lot of the trauma occurred in the body, like would blend some body work in it.
Sure.
So they are doing that with this?
Yeah, there are, I definitely know there are people that combine somatic experiencing with I.F.S. or, experiential focusing method, or, it really comes down to what your own experience is as to what's helpful. And if one really knows the landscape of what's helpful, then you use it. We use whatever's helpful. So it's not like there's a problem with EMDR and I.F.S. I mean, whatever's helpful is helpful. And our parts will know if it's helpful, and our self will really know if it's helpful.
In the resources, can you list how we can research? I imagine that we could Google and find practitioners, but you might have a better lead on how to connect with.
There, on the I.F.S. Website, the Institute website, there's a list of practitioners in US, Canada, other countries, I.F.S. certified people. And the same with the I.F.S.CA Canada, ifsca.ca. Derek Scott has a list of people who've done training and who are I.F.S. Now, again, Derek's training wasn't a certification training in the same way that the one in the States is. It's much shorter, much less expensive, but extremely helpful for someone who wants to be informed in I.F.S. And virtually everyone who takes it is a therapist or a coach. But yeah, I'll put together whatever resources I can think of, and I'm sure Maya has a lot more. And together we'll send that to Jim, and Jim can just send it out to everybody.
Yeah, but also to say that the way you get in touch with parts is to feel in your body where in your body do you feel them, and so it is very sort of fundamentally somatic in approach. Yeah.
Well, I guess we're quickly coming up on an hour and a half, which I think is more or less the limit today. Is there one last question or comment or concern, anything that people have before we close?
Anything more about Sonia Rinpoche? Or do you think that'll take too long?
Oh, yes, I actually meant to talk about that, forgive me. So Sonia Rinpoche has a website called fullybeing.org. So fullybeing, one word.org. And it's open to the public. There's actually a short course that's free, a mini course. And then those who really want to take a deep dive with his teachings, which I think are amazing, one can subscribe for $15 US a month. And there's over 150 video clips from his teachings over the years on fully being. And what he means by fully being is learning how to let go of intellectualizing our experience and actually feel the feeling, feel the experience. And as I said earlier, he recognized that Westerners are in some ways kind of estranged from their own feeling. And so the progression in fully being is one learns how to drop into the body, let go of thought, and do handshake practice, which is similar to I.F.S. in as much as you actually care for and talk with that part of you that is not okay, that is feeling burdened. I.F.S. is again far more, I would say, what's the word? User-friendly in as much as learning about exiles, learning about self-energy and so on. It gives one a map that is a little less accessible in fully being. Nevertheless, the teachings there are incredibly helpful for understanding what it means to feel. And I think Sonia Rinpoche's teachings on how to feel feelings rather than think about your feelings are they're pure gold. They're really helpful. And the Buddhist trajectory there, for those of you who are Buddhist, is basically if you can handshake your beautiful monster and begin to feel its pain, and it begins to basically trust your care for it, very much like I.F.S., your interest in it, it self-liberates, it opens. And when it opens, that energy that it's been kind of holding is released. And when it's released, one begins to actually connect with what Rinpoche calls essence love, which he says is the seed for bodhicitta, for compassion, for loving kindness. Essence love is this reservoir of love that has no object. It's not about loving yourself or loving someone else. It is, in essence, love. And he says that happens when we are able to let go, or I should say, when we're able to really care for and help liberate our beautiful monsters, our exiles and protectors. And from there, he teaches shamatha with object, shamatha without object. So working with mindfulness practice, awareness practice, and then eventually those people who want to go further and study nature of mind practice and Dzogchen and Mahamudra can do so. But his basic point is, unless we're a healthy human being practicing advanced practices, we're just, in my own experience, I just ended up weaponizing my practices against myself because they never were good enough. I never could practice good enough. That makes sense.
Thanks.
Well,
Thanks, Jim.
I'd like to say thank you. Can you hear me? All right.
Yeah.
No, I'd like to thank you very much, Alan, for a wonderful presentation. You know, bringing these traditions together and very timely. You know, I think it's so opportune that you're presenting this at a time when I think this really, a lot of us are dealing with these issues, and they're very meaningful and very personal and important to us. So thank you very much for this. It was great. And I want to thank everybody else who's been here, because I know your presence helped, you know, bring out this intelligence and wisdom. So, you know, good to meet all of you or see all of you again. And I hope that everybody, you know, progresses well and feels deeply into what's really there and becomes fully enlightened. Thank you. All right.
Thank you, everybody.